Hey, everybody, welcome. We are going to get started in about 1 minute. So settle in. If you're on the East Coast with hopefully a bite to eat for lunch, West Coast, a nice cup of coffee. And I'm always jealous of our friends in the EU where it's getting to be the end of the day. So we'll see you online and back here in about 1 minute. And if you're interested, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And then we're going to have a fun question that we're going to ask the panelists when we do our introductions that we'd love to hear your answers on as well as we kick off. All right. So welcome everybody to the February version of WeSpire Live. I could not be more excited about today's topic because it's near and dear to my heart as a former chief marketing officer. I am joined today by Mignon Senuta, who has been an ESG communications executive at a number of companies, some that you know very, very well, and some that are a little more behind the scenes. And that is a fabulous perspective to have, having been in both B2C and B2B myself. And Susan McPherson, who's the founder and CEO of McPherson Strategies, and hot off a top 50 ESG influencer designation yesterday. Incredibly well-deserved, Susan. So welcome. So I would love for each of you to introduce yourself a little bit and how you ended up in ESG communications. And then share with us an example of something that you consider to be a big ESG comms win, or maybe a big ESG comms miss. And I'd love for those of you who are listening today and participating today, if you have ideas of a big ESG win or a big ESG miss, feel free to share those in the chat because I think it's always fun to see what people think. So Susan, why don't you start?
And we're going to have a bit of a Susan S and Susan M to be able to make sure when we say Susan. Anyhow, thank you, Susan. It's such an honor to be here today. And I only wish I could give you a hug in person. And I'm honored also to be alongside Mignon and to be greeting and meeting all these folks in the audience. As mentioned, I'm Susan McPherson. I founded McPherson Strategies 10 years ago after many, many years in now what we call ESG communications. But as we know, it has had many different names throughout at least the, dare I say, 30 years of my career. Yes, I'm that old. But we now, Susan, Mignon, and I, we all have vibrant careers because of the growth of this industry. And I would say that a campaign, which may not be associated with a specific individual, but a campaign that really emboldened me as a young child to start off in fighting for a clean environment happened in the 70s when I came of age. And some of you who are closer to my age may remember the incredible ad campaign, I believe run by the Ad Council, that showed the Native American with a tear running down his face in response to the increasing garbage that people were dumping out their car windows because there were no laws back then. This was like just at the birth of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And this commercial, to this day, I still get chills if I see it, if it pops in my brain. And it literally just put an imprint in the next 40, 50 years of my life to make environmental and saving our environment a good chunk. And I do fervently believe, and I always will believe, that business has a huge role to play in that.
Absolutely. And I, as a child of the 70s myself, absolutely remember that. And I think I've seen somewhere that it's considered one of the most effective behavior change campaigns that really, really stopped, among many other things, litter, and particularly litter coming out of cars along highways. Mignon, love to have you introduce yourself and how you got into this crazy career and an example that you want to share with folks. And a reminder to folks, we'd love to see your examples in the chat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Susan. Thank you. And congrats to Susan M. for the well-earned recognition. Mignon Senuta, as Susan mentioned, I've been working in this field in a few different capacities for over a decade now. Started out in public-private partnerships primarily, so really entered this space more from a nonprofit policy intersection with business. And had the opportunity to work with a bunch of companies on that side of things and really understand what their ESG priorities were. And, at that time, their corporate social responsibility priorities were, and where we could partner in a thought leadership capacity. And then from there, moved in-house, if you will, and really got to understand the complexities and the nuances of integrating ESG and sustainability within companies, different sectors, sizes, et cetera. So really excited to be here and to have a great conversation. You mentioned, or you asked, what is the biggest win or fail that we've seen in this space? It's a really broad one, but I think this is a space where there is a proliferation of acronyms. It's that's what we're here to talk about, the jargon, the jargoned nature of this space. And I think building a discipline around an acronym was potentially sort of what opened the door for something like that. So I think potentially, really rooting ourselves in this ESG acronym really set us down the path to, an endless plethora of acronyms. And, maybe if we could go back in the time machine, maybe we'd do that a little differently.
Yeah, exactly. It's the only executive that has an acronym in their name, potentially, in terms of their role. That's a great one. So my example, and I really felt this last week when, along with 2,000 of my closest friends in sustainability, was in Phoenix, where it was like 32 degrees in Phoenix in February, and it was 65 in Boston. And I just, have really felt like for a long time, one of the biggest fails was calling the destabilization of climate global warming, because it's not what people always experience. Absolutely. Sometimes it is extreme heat, but it's also extreme cold and extreme wind and extreme. And so if we'd actually gotten the name right and talked about the fact that we were going from something highly predictable that happened every single year, generally in the same way, to things that were just going to be like crazy land, on the extremes, and had actually talked about destabilizing, I think we might have won over people much more so, and been able to avoid all this stupid rhetoric around, well, it's not warming, it's 32 in Phoenix, and that we experience. So that's my example. So I'm going to start with Susan right now, because you have worked with dozens of companies on their, maybe even hundreds at this point, around communicating their impact strategies more broadly, and some of the ESG goals in particular. And you and I both know this is hard. Why do you think it's so hard? And why do you think there's so much jargon in the space? And what's the problem with this space having so much jargon in it? And what do you think we can do about that?
Well, to level set, every industry has its jargon, right? You mentioned came up in finance, some of us came up in tech. I mean, when you think about the jargon everywhere, it needs to be obliterated overall. So I would say that I don't think ESG and sustainability is anywhere different from all these other industries. And what we're doing when we speak in jargon is we are preventing others from engaging, from learning, from feeling welcome, from feeling like they have a stake in the game. So when you do all that, you miss the boat. And I think for our industry, which is all about engagement, and you hear the word stakeholders, the stakeholders are enormous. You have employees, you have investors, you have the communities in which you operate, you have your partners, you have your distributor, on and on and on. And the more you talk in jargon, the more you are preventing actual change and success from taking place. And you're also creating hierarchies. You're preventing people, you mentioned at Greenbiss that, the numbers, and there were plenty of people looking for jobs. People aren't going to be able to find jobs if they don't understand what you're talking about. So, the first question is we're hurting ourselves, we're hurting the industry, and we're hurting the opportunity for advancement. And now I forgot your other question you asked me.
Well, what, as folks who are in the space, what can we do to make it better? What can we do to bring down the jargon, to reduce the jargon, to eliminate the jargon?
We don't have to, when we say SEC, we can start by saying the Securities and Exchange Commission, okay? We also, not everything has to be labeled, right? I mean, if you poll the American public and they read, oh, Patagonia is sustainable. Yes, people know the brand Patagonia, but it's actually how Patagonia shows up in the world that makes people want to shop, want to engage. So no animal testing, paying a living wage, encouraging people to vote. That is what makes the individual, the consumer, the shopper, the employee feel emboldened to that particular organization. So you don't hear Patagonia standing up on the bully pulpit saying we are sustainable. Instead, they're talking about what they're doing, and they do it.
Yes.
So as someone,
and in clear, simple language.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
to me, the more we speak and use ISSB, CTS, all these things, no one understands it. We're just speaking to each other in an elevator. That's it.
Echo chamber.
To me, just speak English or French or whatever is your native tongue, and explain and put the action next to the verbiage, right? Nobody wants to hear a bunch of verbiage if you don't have action to back it up.
Yeah. And I love that it's put the action in, not just the words, put the action in, because people understand behavior and they understand actions and things like that, near and dear to obviously WeSpire's heart. And yes, I agree with our chat. Actions speak louder than words. That is so true. So Mignon, you've been inside companies trying to do communications and effective communications and things like that. And you've had very different types of companies, a giant, well-known consumer brand like McDonald's that isn't always equated, with ESG. And despite, I've known Bob and Francesca very well, despite a lot of incredible efforts that they've made, and then worked in a smaller digital B2B, more oriented brand. So what made things harder or easier and in those different environments? And what are some of the day-to-day challenges you ran into?
Yes, it's vastly different across industry or, organizational size, leadership teams. When I was at McDonald's, just the sheer complexity of the organization, the business model being a franchise model with a hyper local impact model, orienting all stakeholders around the same objectives was really challenging. So for example, in 2020, when I was leading the effort to put together the first comprehensive ESG report for the organization, on a daily basis, I could be in touch with 6, 7, 8 countries across, everywhere where McDonald's is operating. I would be in touch with every function imaginable, HR, risk management, corporate secretary's office, Ronald McDonald House Charities. Every sliver of the organization was a thought partner, a reviewer. ESG encompasses everything, so everybody really needed to be involved. So that just the internal alignment was an incredible challenge at a large global complex organization. The other thing that was really noteworthy is just the appetite for risk. So at a company like McDonald's, where the sheer level of scrutiny is unparalleled, the pressure, the pressure for it to be accused of greenwashing and now potentially green hushing if there's paralysis from inaction due to risks with greenwashing. So leadership resistance can be there, whether that's founded or not. And there's not much of an incentive some of the time to be a first mover in some of these circumstances. So that sort of wait and see and being more reactive and responsive can sometimes be tempting for these large organizations, just given, the climate. And then the other thing I would just say is, Susan was talking about stakeholders. There's sometimes just a complexity of stakeholder needs and what's going to resonate with stakeholders. So for example, at McDonald's, when we think about consumers and how they think about McDonald's ESG and sustainability story, what they most closely come in contact with is the packaging, is the ability to recycle, utensils and packaging at a restaurant potentially. From an ESG impact perspective, that's incredibly important, but is it the biggest lever that the company can pull from a climate perspective, from a broader sustainability perspective? Probably not. So just this idea of the larger NGOs, those validators that are watching this space closely and heavily scrutinizing these companies, they might want to hear more on a topic. Consumers are going to want to hear on different topics. They might want to hear about Ronald McDonald House Charities and recycling and some of these other areas. So it's not that these things are mutually exclusive, but when it comes to communications, you obviously don't want to overdo it. So where do you really want to drive impact with those stakeholders? So lots of exciting challenges and opportunities at a place like McDonald's. At a smaller organization, a B2B technology, obviously different set of issues to manage. Smaller organization, being a member of the leadership team was able to get buy-in pretty significantly. But when you're a smaller organization, you also have fewer resources, especially at a time when companies are going through massive transformations and, everyone is feeling pressure and, really being challenged on the ESG front if they're going to continue to invest in it. So, just a total different set of circumstances. And we were really shaking the cage. We were trying to get the world's attention, as opposed to maybe a larger brand who has a million things coming at them at once. We wanted to be able to build awareness of our story, and that our story was more about, it was less about doing less harm, and it was more about, this is what we want to achieve in the world from an impact perspective. So I found myself talking a lot less about ESG risk and mitigating the risks that we have externally, and talking a lot more about, here's the ESG impact we want to have. And that's just a lot harder to do.
And the ESG opportunity, that's such a fun conversation to have with folks when you get to have them. So, you've all had experiences, and in the case of Susan, you run communications firms. So, most people attending today are practitioners in some aspect of impact broadly, or maybe ESG very specifically, and don't necessarily own communications. Some do, and some don't. Some need to partner with other groups, whether it's an external agency or an internal comms team or things like that around communications. And struggle sometimes, particularly on if it's the internal comms team, with the lack of expertise on that team. And so these can be very complex topics. So, how do you recommend that ESG practitioners work with comms groups, whether that's their external agencies, internal teams? And when should they really opt for bringing specialized folks in, or at least advocate for that? Susan, you might have a perspective having been on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, to be selfish, we always like to come in, meaning a communications firm, early on, because when the strategy is being developed, communications should be at the table, but that can be internal persons. It doesn't have to be an outside firm such as ours, or a freelancer or what have you. But it's interesting. I look back probably in 2006 or 7, when I was getting to know one of the kind of beacons in this space, Dave Stangus, who Susan, and Mignon, you probably do. And he had framed something very interesting to me that I think will be kind of just enlightening to people just starting out in the industry. In sustainability and what previously was called like corporate responsibility and corporate citizenship, there were often two ways to come into the field. One was through operations, supply chain, and the other was through communications. As transparency kind of came in social media in the early aughts, when companies could communicate with their customers without going through a middleman like the media, all of a sudden, communications became so much more important, right? Then you have this massive influx of and rise of companies reporting. because Wall Street asked for it, and other foreign stock markets and the financial community. So you had this like collision or perfect storm of the need for communications. And I used to always say, you go to all this trouble, you spend all these hours and investment dollars on creating this annual sustainability report that, guess what, no one's going to read, because if you don't tell people about it, no one's going to find it. And if you don't make it actionable and interesting to the various audiences you're serving it up, again, it will fall on deaf ears. So I fervently believe communications needs to have a seat at the table early on, whether, again, it's through a third party. And I can share kind of a bit of a framework that we use rather than kind of a checklist that could be applicable and should be, as you're thinking about your ESG program, what may that be? One, who are you talking to? Who's the audience? Is it because for every portion of this, let's just say, endeavor, you're going to have differing audiences. So depending on who you're talking to, it's going to alter what you're going to, what you're going to bake, let's say. So could it be your employees, your investors, your partners, your customers? Two, determine how those audiences are impacted both from within your organization and outside your organization. Three, what specific issues are you aiming to address? Fortunately or unfortunately, ESG has become this ginormous umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on who you ask, it will mean 1,000 different things, right? So you need to define what it means for you and for your organization and for your audiences. And under that umbrella that you so entitle it, what are the issues you're trying to address? Is it DE&I? Is it governance? Is it your supply chain? Is it your packaging? All the things.
Yeah.
4, how is your organization uniquely positioned to solve or talk about this issue? Why you? And lastly, to give the people who you are sharing this with or telling the story to, what is their opportunity to engage? How do they step up and be part of this? And that's where your storytelling comes into mind, because that's the only way people are going to care. So that's kind of a framework to kind of pull from, use, carry in your back pocket.
Absolutely. Well, and I think one thing, and Mignon, you've probably seen this in your career as well, because I'm going to, without calling him out, share one of my favorite stories of why it's important to understand not just what you care about in impact, but have a good sense for what others may care about in the impact. And this was one where, as a very strong sustainability executive, really tied to materiality, was not thinking cups was the thing that they needed to focus on, because it's actually the milk. The milk is the problem in terms of materiality. And yet all anyone wants to talk about is the cups, and if you ignore the cups, then you wind up having to go sit in regulatory offices in Canada when you are summoned to them for not appropriately offering recycling and all of this. And yet, as an executive, you're like, it's the milk, people, it's the milk, and so I'm sure you have run into those times where it's how important it is, as Susan said, Mignon, to understand what others are going to care about, even if that's not the thing that really matters. And how do you both address that from a comms standpoint, and how do you get people internally kind of on board with, I know this isn't super top of mind for us, but it's really important to the stakeholder?
Yeah, it's an excellent example that you've anonymized, and I've seen that time and time again. I think like with any communications and any influencing exercise, what Susan said, you just have to make it relevant for each functional group and understand what is in it for them. Why is it relevant for IR and their stakeholders? Like, does your CHRO really understand why ESG is relevant for the employer brand? So building those relationships internally is so important, and it takes time to do that. And it's a trust building exercise, and it's showing proof points and getting out of your own lens exclusively. So I would say that's step number one. And And then integrating into existing systems. If we're really talking about ESG integration, how can we build support internally for something like that? Build and integrate an ESG training into onboarding, build a straightforward, internal comms toolkit for employees to use in conversations with their stakeholders, whether that's somebody on the sales team or somebody in talent acquisition. How are we talking about our ESG story? And when I say ESG story, I don't mean, just our commitment to ESG, because what does that mean? To Susan's earlier point, we really need to identify what are the topics and the impact areas that are relevant for the business and where, you're uniquely positioned to have an impact, or you're highly, highly accountable for a high impact area. So I think just integrating into those existing systems, building more buy-in is going to allow you to be more successful. And then just a comment, because you mentioned agencies before, and I think external, in my experience, I feel like there's a lot more specialized agency support these days. A lot of these agencies are, they are very sophisticated and they understand the issues. They understand ESG and sustainability in the corporate context. And so they can be a huge asset, even if you do have internal expertise, having that external lens. And then on the other side of that, I do think that companies are realizing, rather than just having agency support alone or having one or two maybe early career folks that are focused on this to just kind of do the ESG work is also insufficient, because somebody who really understands the business, who can do all of that influencing, who can build relationships and really get these things on the top of the agenda and make it relevant is also really important. And sometimes that takes somebody who's a little bit more seasoned in the area.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that we find sometimes being a technology provider in the space is that people think that having the technology is going to solve the problem. And one of the things we often have to say to folks is like, hey, the technology is the delivery mechanism for your strategy and your programs. And you've got to work and make sure that you've got a good strategy and really good programs, or it's going to be very challenging for the technology to do it. And what's funny is that you would never have to, I come out of marketing. I can't imagine having to say that in marketing where, it's like, oh, okay, we're going to buy HubSpot, but we're not going to have anybody to do the marketing or any marketing campaigns or programs. We're just going to get HubSpot, and HubSpot's great. And they have templates to help you market and all of that. But again, you have to have marketers to use it, and you have to have the programs and the offers and the campaigns that you want to run. And so it's making sure you have both of those things has been really critical. And, we really see the difference with customers when they have gone through the process of creating not just an ESG strategy, but really an ESG engagement strategy. Like, how are we going to actually talk to all these different stakeholders, employees being the one we care about the most, on this, and then what is it that we want them to do? Get back, Susan, to your point around action. What is it that we want employees or other stakeholders to know, to feel, to do, and to share are kind of the four things that we think about a lot in this. And how do you then get them to know that, to feel that, to do that, and share that, and it's not easy, needless to say. All right, I'm going to do a fun little round robin for a second with an acronym. We talked about how much they need to go away. So let's pick an acronym that's trending right now that everyone's hearing a little bit about, that you think is important and that we should all on this call pay attention to. But what word should we use to start to describe why it's important? So Mignon, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Just because it's super timely, I would say that the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, is one that I'm certainly paying attention to. And it's very relevant for TCFD and SASB and some of these other ones. But it's, from what I understand, they finalized the content this month, and it's going to become effective. The first two standards, S1 and S2, will be effective next year, which is really exciting. And in particular, another acronym that I'm excited to see how they further integrate it is the TNFD, the Task force on nature-related financial disclosures. I think there's a growing recognition that that's an area that needs, a more sophisticated approach and needs to be integrated into the climate disclosure space. So I'm really interested to see where that takes us later this year when they launch their framework. I think it's in September.
And I use the, how do I explain this to my mother test? I used to have to do that when I was in the early days of the internet. And so how do I explain this to my mother? I would explain it as, we are finally getting a set of rules and standards that every company has to follow for how they're going to report data. It's going to be great because it's crazy land right now. Susan.
Well, and to add to that, I always, when I try to explain it, is you'll be able to compare apples to apples, meaning
Oh yeah,
Coke and Pepsi, although very different companies, obviously, but be able to see how they differ in terms of their carbon footprint and their impact on the environment, as well as swaths of society. I hate them all, honestly, but given the focus on reporting and ISSB, I would have to say what we talked about earlier, and that is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, because people in the know, whoever those people are, seem to believe that within a month, the SEC will come out with their formalized rules to enhance and standardize how US companies will be reporting. And for people who aren't in the know, like 99% of us, the US has been quite behind. European companies have been, and regulators have been far ahead in terms of stipulating how and when companies and what they report on. And this would go a long way to help get us to catch up. And since so many US based companies, market sell into the EU, this will also help give some sort of just container for all of this on how they're going to report and show. So I'll stop there.
No, and I also think the Securities and Exchange Commission and the SEC being involved in doing this is forcing two groups of people who have sat next to each other for a long time, but generally had to, only sort of pay attention to each other to start to really get to know each other well. And that's the CFO and the finance side of the organization. And the thing I've heard from a number of folks who are not in this space, the beauty of having an MBA is I have lots of friends who are on Wall Street, and it's like two things are happening. If they're in companies, their CEOs now have to explain this to investors and to regulators, and are now knowing that this is going to be something they have to do as part of being a public company. And in some cases, the soon to be public / large privates will have to follow the same rules. And so all of a sudden CEOs and CFOs are paying attention in a way that they never had. The other piece of this that I hadn't really thought about until I realized that something rather monumental had happened a few months back, which is we actually had the first federal and sort of government raid on a bank for ESG fraud.
Wow.
Because they had misstated in their regulatory filings the amount of assets. And it was a whistleblower case that an American went over to be part of the ESG team at a subsidiary of Deutsche Bank, realized was happening, tried to solve it internally, ended up having to go to the Wall Street Journal, and they've been raided in the last 2 weeks. And so the other thing that happens when all of a sudden the Securities and Exchange Commission is now there's enforcement, and there hasn't been really an enforcement arm in ESG other than media and sort of, publicity and public shaming type stuff, but there hasn't really been an enforcement element. And I think that's a night and day change that I hadn't really thought through the ramifications of, and just how much it would make things are getting serious is the term that's being used. So we have a number of questions that is, in here. So one of the questions is, with so many different regulations and standards changing globally, do you have any best practices or advice for how you keep track of everything? Like, what do you do to stay in the know on this as professionals in the field?
I read voraciously. I don't recommend that. I also am not shy to ask questions on various social channels and various LinkedIn groups, on the behemoth that we now all love to hate, Twitter. But I think, when you have questions, the beautiful thing about people in this community, and I can honestly say it because I've been involved in some semblance of ESG communications now for more than 23 years, people generally want to help. So if you have questions, go to some of these online sites and ask. But it does help to be a voracious reader and have an appetite for it.
Lifelong learn.
Yeah, be curious.
I would agree with that completely, personally, but another from the company lens, something to consider is if you're working, on ESG inside a company, a lot of times your colleagues in legal or in governance might have outside counsel or other resources who, are already doing webinars and are already tracking these things and sending daily briefs or weekly briefs to some of these colleagues, and it just doesn't necessarily have an ESG wrapper around it. So, but the content is there. So it might just be worth looking at internally to see if anybody else has access to some of this real-time information.
One other good point, it's only a recent phenomenon that the general news media has been covering this industry. It used to only be the purview of Green Biz, maybe a little bit Fast Company and a swath of financial publications. Now you have the New York Times, you have the Wall Street Journal, you have the Washington Post, you have Time Magazine. Time Magazine just did a massive piece just the other day on the CEO of Chobani and how he has made, now granted, we're getting out of like the true definition of ESG and more into like purpose and things, but the fact that Time Magazine dedicated a massive piece on purpose and companies doing, going extra line, in this case, helping with a refugee reform and being a refugee, it's been his kind of passion point. So for the person asking this question, the beautiful thing is you don't have to dive too deep to find, at least in the general news media.
Yeah. And you actually, Susan, raised something that, ESG, you talk about the E a lot, but the S is really important. And the S is certainly a huge part of some of the reporting, as well as supplier evaluations and things like that. And we have a question from an attendee about, are you finding that companies are thinking about employee volunteering and employee donations as a core part of ESG? Are they really including it in ratings and rankings in an important way? Or is it just something that, you feel like they're doing more for some of the publicity, PR, community connections? Like, how tied do you see the, sort of volunteering and giving into ESG?
What do you think, Mignon?
I mean, it's certainly, part of those scorecards, and it's something that when we're building an ESG report, you want to make sure we're providing visibility towards. I don't know if it's one or the other. I think these things, they serve multiple purposes. And if you're engaging your workforce and you're helping them feel more connected to the business and to their workplace, whether it's for an external PR audience or for internal retention and recruitment, that very might well be, but it's still reflected in, the MSCIs and Sustainalytics analysis of the world as well, in terms of what do you do to outreach to your employees and to engage them in some of these things. I think one thing that's interesting that I've noticed is, how do we define sort of community relations or volunteerism or charitable giving in this increasingly global and remote world? That's a challenge that I've personally encountered in the workplace when trying to think about this from a materiality perspective. How do we want to define the communities we serve? How do we define community in this day and age? So that's just one angle. I think that there's something interesting there that's going to be teased out in the years to come.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because since we support both social impact programs with volunteering and giving, as well as sustainability programs, along with D&I and other things, one of the things we look at is who's requiring all of the information around all these 4 programs right now. And obviously GRI is a big one, the Global Reporting Initiative on that front. But increasingly, it's also things like EcoVadis, which is an evaluation that companies are using to do supply chain sustainability and ESG. And it's a set of questions. And I found this fascinating experience where we got asked to complete it as a supplier for one of our customers. And I ended up going to our version of WeSpire to go get the data to be able to answer some of the questions, particularly in the area of social impact and D&I. The trend I'm seeing though, is companies are wanting to get out of the business of just looking at dollars and hours and translating the dollars and hours into the actual social outcomes it drove, and seeing a much stronger connection between how did our employees' time and our time, and how did our employees and our treasure drives to the social outcomes within that. And so being able to link those two things, and we're doing some pretty exciting work with some clients to try to answer that question and be able to have a much more sophisticated approach to that than I think historically. It's just been hard, as you both know. There's another question here that is around the political aspect of this, which is purely a US thing at the moment. I hope that stays that way. But obviously there's been some backlash and some attempts to use regulations to slow down momentum in ESG, whether that's suing companies that are investing with a CSR lens, or not allowing state funds to be put into funds that have an ESG lens, or things like that. And so the question that the person has is, how do you communicate your commitment to ESG with the risk that's inherent, given that it's getting more political, and risk being, in this person's perspective, that if certain firms in certain industries speak up, they can get sued or ridiculed by one of the major political parties. So how do you handle that as an ESG professional?
Well, it's a real scare. I will quote our friend Alan Murray, who's the CEO of Fortune magazine, who just last week brought together CEOs of various companies to do a roundtable, and not one of them stated that they were going to slow down their sustainability and ESG goals in response. And these were the CEOs of the largest US corporations. And Just Capital comes out every year with their Just 100, the companies that are, according to consumer research, are taking the lead in terms of public opinion. And almost all of, let me back up, the criteria tended to go with how companies were treating their employees and how they were making sure that they were staying ahead by being inclusive, all those things, which again, we consider woke, right? And Bank of America shot to #1 based on the way, evidently, and again, I didn't see all the research, and I'm not I'm not deeply familiar with the methodology, but the point is companies want to be, the vast majority of American public, they don't think of it as woke or not woke. They want companies to do the right thing. And lastly, another interesting anecdote I read today, because there's some conflict going around with the head of the World Bank just stepped down for making some anti-ESG commentary. And the new leader of the World Bank has got his or her their work cut out for them. But Zelensky, the President Zelensky of Ukraine, when he was looking to finance Ukraine, he actually reached out to BlackRock as opposed to the World Bank. So what does that tell you about the future of companies? Anyhow, I'm babbling on, but I think you get the point.
Yeah.
This is not going away, and a company that wants to be around 20 years from now needs to make this a priority. The political headwinds are going to shift and change, et cetera. But this is our planet's future, our livelihoods, our people's future, et cetera. I'll stop now. Sorry.
I'm going to look at, no, I think you're totally right, Susan. And I would just say, I think there's some really positive examples of times where recently a company has taken a very courageous decision that could have potentially had a massive backlash from certain stakeholder groups, and in fact may have had that backlash and actually did better as a result. And the one that jumps to mind is Dick's Sporting Goods, when after Parkland realizing, I think it was Parkland realizing that the gun was bought in a Dick's Sporting Goods store, the CEO just said, no more, we're done, and got out of the business of guns. And historically that, and even when they made that decision, it caused a backlash from, NRA and NRA folks who support the NRA. And yet it had such a positive impact for others that in fact sales went up at Dick's in the wake of that decision, despite the boycott. And so I think there are times where the rhetoric that we hear doesn't reflect the hearts and minds of the American people. And I just, I think one of the most important qualities in leadership right now, particularly around environmental and social topics, is courage. And courage to know in your heart of heart what the right thing is, and to do it and recognize, yeah, you're going to get heat for it. You always will, but ultimately you're likely to prevail, particularly on some of these topics that I think we know are a problem that needs solving, like gun control. So here's a question that actually sparks, Susan, I'm not sure you saw it, but it was one of my favorite posts from Andrew Winston recently. But is there a difference between the terms ESG and sustainability? They seem to be used interchangeably. So Mignon, what are your thoughts on that? And then Susan, love to hear your perspective.
They are often used interchangeably. I'm sure I'm also very guilty of that, as I'm rambling half the time. ESG, I think of as a value driver for sustainable business, and it is more of a criteria, and it is a methodology that you adapt company by company with that sort of company by company screen to ensure that you are managing all of the risks you need to be managing, and that you are identifying all of the opportunities you should be identifying. Sustainability, depending on who you're talking to, can be conflated with environmental sustainability in a much more narrow sense. It can be much broader than that. So I think this is an area where ESG communications, we really need to refine how we're talking about these. I also saw that article. I thought it was very well framed. And yeah, I think this is an area where we need to get a little bit more disciplined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, and it's interesting. ESG came out of like financial services closed door meetings, 35 years ago. And then it was further kind of called by what then was the beginnings of the UN Global Compact, where the Secretary General at the time in the late 90s thought that it made sense to bring business and global impact together, right? And then it was the formation of the UN Global Compact and the leader at the time, Jörg Kell, who really kind of kicked this into high gear. But what Mignon, you just probably much better articulated was the fact that this is we need to get better. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I'm having trouble speaking today.
You're doing just great. So here's an example of a question that somebody says, one example of when an ESG perspective or communication hurt a company is Disney. There's financial implications for speaking out against DeSantis' education legislation. How should a company measure the risk versus the reward of speaking out on these controversial issues? Mignon, my guess is in your career, you have had once or twice where there were some controversial issues. I will never forget Francesca and sitting next to her who was the chief sustainability officer and head of all of global supply chain for McDonald's, and saying, yeah, I have to change how cows are being raised across the world. And I was like, wow, okay, I hadn't thought about that. That's your primary job right now, is how beef is being raised. How have you experienced that risk reward conversation. And then Susan, I'm sure you've been asked to weigh in on that risk reward. So I'd love to hear perspective from the two of you.
Yeah, and I can only speak from my experience. I think this is an area where sitting in a often cross-functional role like an ESG communicator or sustainability, if we're not being quite so disciplined, you're working cross-functionally across an entire organization. This is that perfect time to pull together those partners and thought leaders. If you have an ESG working group, if you have a steering committee, whatever you have internally, people who are focused on public policy, people who are focused on traditional risk management, and really getting that 360 perspective of what are the risks here, and having a really frank discussion, because I don't think there is an easy sort of let's punch this into a calculator kind of solution here. I think this really requires cross-functional and a variety of discipline expertise, and a really, a really frank conversation.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is what a company needs to do when they're put in this position or find themselves in this position is really open the kimono and determine what is the company's ethos? Who are the stakeholders that matter to that company? Who are the customers? And then go into why the company exists in the first place. And I have to say, given Disney's, what they're all about, children, entertainment, all these things, I can understand why they weighed in. Not to mention, I don't know the exact number, but the percentage of employees who are LGBTQ. Yeah. So in some ways, if they didn't say anything, the risk could be greater than saying. And my firm in 2019 created a coalition called Don't Ban Equality, which was getting companies to step up at that time to make a case that there is a connection between economics and access to abortion. And at the time, abortion was not even like no one in the corporate C-suite or boardroom would even say the word, even though, 1 in 3 women have abortions, right? So fast forward to today, the coalition now has 700 leading companies, Unilever, Levi's, et cetera. And it's now more focused on, in a risky environment, of course, but it's now more focused on how to protect and support their workers and their employees, because we know inextricably certain swaths of workers and employees will be harmed by this. So yes, very difficult decision for a company to come out publicly. Our advice always is deal with this internally. It's much more important before. But, as we are looking at a future where youth, Gen Z, want to work for companies that believe are taking stands, that are stepping up. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, a study came out that showed an actual connective tissue between people saying they want to support and actually them showing up and buying. So I think companies have to take a long view, and yes, there's always that risk of immediate blowback, but dare I say, I think Disney's going to be around in 20 years. Can't say that about DeSantis, maybe not, but we know Disney will.
Yeah. And everything I've heard about Disney has been that it was an employee first decision, and that they really weighed. And I think this is such a important time of when you say nothing, you are essentially endorsing the exclusionary treatment of that employee group. And that isn't who Disney is at its core. And I'm sure there were some fascinating conversations about how to come out against this, but ultimately, I think when a large swath of your employees are being negatively impacted by some sort of legislation that is happening at a local level, I don't know how you don't speak up without employees feeling like you are implicitly, supporting that rule.
And it's your earlier point, Susan, about being courageous and what leadership means today. I mean, it's almost a prerequisite to be bold in this area and to take a longer term vision with a lot of this short term risk. So I think that's a really astute point in this case as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question about calls to action and engagement and getting people to do things, and that actions speak louder than words. So how and what are some things that you in your work, either internally or externally as an advisor and creator, what are the kinds of engagements or calls to action that you're finding particularly effective? Maybe something very specific in the past, or something that right now you're kind of working on that you think is really resonating with the intended stakeholders. Susan, do you want to start?
No, I mean, I think, things like the whole issue around voting and protecting democracy. Companies, you could, now for whatever reason, voting has become like a political and partisan issue, when actuality, if we lose our democracy, all of this is going to go away, right? I mean, this whole notion of companies taking a stance, won't even be on the table. So what, in this case, companies are a huge component of the ecosystem that we operate here in, specifically in the United States, or any company. So if a company was going to say, get out and vote, are they making it easy for their employees to vote? Are they giving them paid time off to vote? Are they, giving them information so they can find their polling places? Okay, so again, very specific example, but I think it is something that actually helps companies be a more vested member of society. They're not telling their employees how to vote or who to vote for, but they're feeding this as becoming a important and contributing member of society.
Yeah.
So to me, that would be an exact example. How are you using your power as a business under the ESG umbrella or what have you to get your employees to step up for something that's going to help society?
Well, and I love the lens, it's not about just calling the action. It's also looking at what are the barriers standing in the way of somebody doing this action, and what barriers can I help dismantle and remove. I had an experience with an organization I volunteer with, of a candidate reviewing a job, and one of this organization has the words child cherishing in its mission statement. And they called out that that in the job offer, it delineated only 8 weeks of parental leave, which, oh, by the way, is not even in conformance with the state rule now. And it was, it was one of those outmoded things that hadn't just been addressed. We hadn't had a person in that role who had needed parental leave, so it hadn't been looked at in years. But it was a call out of, wait, you're offering me this job and you say you're child cherishing, and yet this doesn't match. And it was that alignment, and just going through and making sure that these things, back up the values that you're delivering against. Mignon, same question, but I want you, another attendee said, okay, you want people to take action, then how do you communicate it to the different stakeholders? And what are some of the most effective ways that, is it PowerPoint? Is it memos? Is it press releases? Is it videos? Is it sound bites? Is it face-to-face meetings? Like, what works to actually get people to take action in your experience inside an organization?
It's a great question. I think every organization is a little different. From my experience, one thing that was successful and I've heard has been successful elsewhere is setting up sort of an impact management structure internally that allows a ESG communications or program manager to work with each of the SMEs or those leaders or those representatives who understand that stakeholder group the best and really understand how to communicate to them. So for example, with HR, making sure that at a minimum, you're connecting quarterly with that group to talk about your key impact areas like DEI and employee engagement, and checking to make sure your communications are mirroring the action plans that you've set up with them or that they've developed and that you've weighed into. But then how do you also communicate with those stakeholders? They know them the best. And that's just one example. I think really harnessing the knowledge and the connectivity of the entire organization and understanding how to reach people. Those are the channels, a lot of the informal channels. The other more formal channels are really important too. And I'm happy I'd be happy to talk more about that. I know we're running short on time, but I really think those internal channels of communication are incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a question actually about how many sustainability reports, materials, and things should you have, and all of that. And I think one of the things that I watched very successfully is that there's companies that stop thinking about it as a sustainability report that's over here. Yes, you need that it keeps track of the data and all of that, but when it's really effective when you're baking your ESG and sustainability and CSR metrics into every communication that's going out in some way, shape, or form from a strategic standpoint, and really mapping it into the core business, that it is at the core of every communication, not this bolt-on that happens once a year on that. The last question is an interesting one because we are 3 women in this field. And the question is, what advice would you give women that are in these emerging roles where one of the things they have to do is question business as usual in a male-dominated environment or industry? So what advice do we have as women for women who are having to question gender equity and things related to gender in male-dominated industries?
Well, I will say that this industry is no longer male-dominated.
Exactly.
The challenge becomes is the C-suite still is and the board still are. But there is power in numbers, and there's power in communities, and there's power in connections. And you know, not only because I wrote a book about connections, but take the owners and reach out and connect to people like us who have been in this space for a while and who we fervently believe that the next generation is going to get it right. And I think you will be I hopefully pleasantly surprised by when you see the level of responsiveness, because certainly people have been extraordinarily responsive to me all the way back when I was just starting, and not just women, but the men in the titans in the field, the Paul Pullmans of the world, Dave Stangus, the Tim Moen, Joel Maycower, Aaron Kramer. I mean, these are men who have been working in this field for years, who opened, I don't want to say they opened their arms because that may sound, but in terms of being supportive and leading the way and making connections. So
yeah, I would definitely say the ESG side of my life is much more equitable than my experience as a tech female founder. And so if you're interested in hearing more about how and what you to do on that front, I mean, the answer fundamentally in any male-dominated industry is figure out how to get more women in and support women getting in, and to look at those systems and structures that prevent women from getting in. And unfortunately, in some industries, you really have to go back to middle school to start to undo some of the messaging. So we're going to let everybody go. Thank you so much for today, Susan and Mignon. It's so great to have you here. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month at the WeSpire Live. Take care.
thank you, Susan. Bye, Mignon.
Bye.